Crimson Vows. London, 1918. Evelyn Carter had always dreamed of dancing with Lieutenant Daniel Mercer one last time. When the war ended, she waited for him at the train station, believing he would return. But the years passed and he never did. Then, one evening, as she walked home through the dimly lit streets, she heard the sound of a gramophone playing their song. And when she turned the corner, there he was, standing in the lamplight, waiting for her. Chapter 1. The Gramophone Serenade. The London air hung thick with the scent of damp earth and coal smoke, a familiar perfume that had clung to the city throughout the long, weary years of war. Evelyn Carter pulled her worn woolen coat tighter around her, the November chill seeping into her bones despite the relative mildness of the evening. 1918. The war was over, the armistice signed, but the victory felt hollow, a muted celebration echoing in the hearts of those who had waited, prayed, and lost. Evelyn walked with a measured pace, her footsteps echoing softly on the cobblestone streets. The gaslights flickered, casting elongated shadows that danced like specters around her. She was on her way home from the small bookshop where she worked, a haven of quiet contemplation amidst the city's lingering unease. Books, with their stories of faraway lands and bygone eras, offered a temporary escape from the gnawing emptiness that had settled in her soul. It had been 3 years since she'd last seen Daniel. Lieutenant Daniel Mercer. The name still caught in her throat, a bittersweet melody of love and loss. 3 years since their last hurried embrace on the platform at Charing Cross Station, the steam from the departing train obscuring his face as he promised to return. He'd held her close, his breath warm against her ear, whispering words of love and hope that had sustained her through the endless nights. "I'll come back for you, Evie," he'd said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "We'll have our dance. Just wait for me." And she had waited. Every day, she'd walked to the station, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread, scanning the faces of the returning soldiers, searching for his familiar smile, the crinkle around his eyes that spoke of a gentle soul beneath the uniform. But he never came. The war had swallowed him whole, leaving behind only a void, a silence that screamed louder than any artillery barrage. She had kept his letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon, tucked away in a small wooden box beneath her bed. His words, penned in the trenches, spoke of mud and fear, but also of unwavering love and a longing for home, for her. She reread them often, tracing the lines of his handwriting, searching for clues, for any hint of what might have become of him. Tonight, however, the familiar ache in her chest felt different, sharper. It wasn't just the lingering sadness, the constant companion of her solitude. It was a prickling sensation, a feeling of unease that settled in the pit of her stomach. She tried to dismiss it as fatigue, the cumulative exhaustion of years spent holding onto a fragile hope. As she rounded the corner onto her street, the faint sound of music drifted towards her. It was a gramophone playing a scratchy, melancholic tune. Her heart skipped a beat. It was their song, the one they had danced to at a small, dimly lit club in Soho, just weeks before he was deployed. A waltz, slow and bittersweet, filled with unspoken promises and the fragile beauty of young love. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The music seemed to emanate from the small, overgrown garden of the abandoned house at the end of the street. The house had been empty for years, its windows boarded up, a silent testament to the war's relentless reach. No one ever went near it, yet the music played on, a haunting melody that tugged at her heartstrings. Curiosity, mixed with a strange sense of foreboding, drew her closer. She hesitated at the rusted iron gate, its hinges creaking in protest as she pushed it open. The garden was a tangle of weeds and overgrown bushes, the moonlight filtering through the bare branches of the trees, casting eerie shadows on the cracked paving stones. And then she saw him. He was standing in the center of the garden, bathed in the soft glow of a single gas lamp that miraculously still burned. He was taller than she remembered, his shoulders broader, his face leaner, etched with the harsh realities of war. But it was him, Daniel. His uniform was worn and faded, but his eyes, Those deep blue eyes that had always held her captive were unmistakable. He stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the gramophone, a small, portable model resting on a crumbling stone bench. The music swelled, filling the silence of the night, and then, slowly, he turned towards her. Her name escaped her lips, a whispered breath carried on the night air. Daniel? His eyes met hers, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The years of waiting, the pain, the uncertainty, all melted away in that single, heart-stopping glance. A flicker of recognition, of something akin to disbelief, crossed his face. He didn't smile. He didn't rush towards her. He simply stood there, staring at her, as if she were a ghost, a figment of his war-torn imagination. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions, with the weight of years and battles and the lingering scent of gunpowder. Then, his voice, rough and unfamiliar, broke the spell. Evie? It was a question, a plea, a whisper of hope tinged with a profound sadness that sent a shiver down her spine. The song ended, the needle lifting from the record with a soft click, leaving an echoing silence that was even more profound than the music. What had happened to him? Where had he been all these years? The question swirled in her mind, but the look in his eyes, the haunted expression that shadowed his features, warned her that the answers would not be easy. They were not the same people who had parted ways at the train station. The war had changed them both. But the connection, the undeniable pull that had drawn them together, remained, a fragile thread in the tapestry of their shattered lives. The next few moments, she knew, would determine if that thread could be woven into something stronger, or if it would break, leaving them forever lost in the shadows of the past. The gramophone stood silent, a cold, metal witness to the reunion, the music replaced by the heavy silence of the London night. Chapter 2. Ghosts of Charing Cross. He took a step towards her, hesitant, as if unsure whether she was real or a phantom conjured by the night. The lamplight flickered, casting dancing shadows on his face, highlighting the new lines etched around his eyes, the subtle tremor in his hands. He was thinner, too, his uniform hanging loosely on his frame, a stark reminder of the hardships he must have endured. Evie, he repeated, his voice still a low murmur. Is it really you? She nodded, tears welling in her eyes, blurring her vision. Daniel, it's me. I've been waiting. The words felt inadequate, a pale reflection of the years of longing, the countless nights spent dreaming of this moment. But they were all she could manage, her throat constricted with emotion. He closed the distance between them, reaching out a hand as if to touch her face, then hesitating, his fingers hovering just inches from her cheek. His hand was calloused, scarred, a testament to the brutal realities he had faced. The sight of those scars, a map of his suffering, brought a fresh wave of tears to her eyes. I thought, he began, his voice trailing off, his gaze searching hers. I thought you'd have moved on, found someone else. The unspoken question hung in the air, a reflection of his own doubts, his own insecurities. Had he stayed away deliberately? Had he believed she wouldn't wait? Never, she whispered, shaking her head. I could never forget you, Daniel. He finally touched her, his fingers gently tracing the curve of her cheek, his touch sending a shiver of warmth through her chilled body. It was a tentative touch, as if he were afraid she might vanish, a fragile dream shattered by the harsh realities of the world. I saw you, he said, his voice barely audible above the rustling of the leaves. At Charing Cross, after the armistice. I saw you waiting. Her heart leaped. He had been there. He had seen her. But why hadn't he approached her? Why had he stayed away? Why didn't you come to me? She asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of relief and confusion. I waited for you, Daniel. Every day. He withdrew his hand, his gaze dropping to the overgrown garden path. I couldn't, he whispered. I wasn't ready. The words were cryptic, shrouded in a mystery that deepened the unease she had felt since hearing the gramophone. What had happened to him? What had changed him so drastically? He looked up again, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. There's so much you don't know, Evie. So much I haven't told you. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. His hand was cold, despite the warmth of her touch. Tell me, she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her heart.
Tell me everything.
He hesitated, his gaze darting around the garden, as if searching for an escape. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the distant sounds of the city, the rumble of a passing motor car, the faint cry of a night bird. Not here, he finally said, his voice low and urgent. It's not safe here. Safe? What did he mean? The war was over. What danger could there possibly be in this deserted garden? Where then? She asked, her mind racing with possibilities. Was he involved in something clandestine? Had he been injured, perhaps mentally scarred by his experiences? He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and fear. My place. It's not far. Will you come with me? She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what awaited her, what secrets he was hiding, but she knew she had to follow him. She had waited too long, endured too much uncertainty, to turn back now. She trusted him, despite the changes she saw in him, despite the unsettling mystery that surrounded him. He led her out of the garden, his hand still gripping hers, as if he were afraid of losing her again. They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing on the pavement, their shadows stretching long and distorted in the gaslight. The city seemed to hold its breath, waiting, watching, as they navigated the dimly lit streets, their shared past and uncertain future hanging heavy in the air between them. The ghosts of Charing Cross, of their last farewell, walked with them, silent witnesses to their reunion and the secrets that lay hidden beneath the surface of their carefully guarded hearts. The weight of what was unsaid felt heavier than the London fog. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Blitzed Garden. His place, as he called it, was a small, sparsely furnished room above a bakery in a quiet side street off Lambeth Road. The air was thick with the sweet scent of yeast and sugar, a comforting aroma that momentarily eased the tension that had been building within Evelyn since their reunion. The room itself was surprisingly tidy, considering Daniel's presumed circumstances. A narrow bed, a worn armchair, a small table with 2 chairs, and a chest of drawers were the only furnishings. A single window, partially covered by a faded curtain, offered a limited view of the street below. It's not much, Daniel said, his voice apologetic, as he closed the door behind them, but it's home for now. He gestured towards one of the chairs, inviting her to sit. He remained standing, leaning against the door, as if guarding it against some unseen threat. The room was dimly lit by a single gas lamp, casting long shadows that danced on the walls, mirroring the turmoil in Evelyn's heart. She sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on him. He looked even more worn and weary in the confines of the small room, the lines of his face more pronounced, the shadows under his eyes deeper. Daniel, she began, her voice hesitant. What's going on? Why were you hiding? Why didn't you come to me at the station? He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his gaze avoiding hers. He looked like a cornered animal, trapped and desperate. It's complicated, he said, his voice strained. There are things I can't explain, not yet. Try me, she said, her voice firmer now, her patience wearing thin. I deserve to know, Daniel. I've waited 3 years for you. I've lived with the uncertainty, the fear, the emptiness. I deserve the truth. He finally met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and something else. Something she couldn't quite decipher. Guilt? Shame? I was injured, he said, his voice low and hesitant. Not physically, not in the way you might think, but mentally. The things I saw, the things I did, they changed me, Evie. I wasn't the same man who left you at Charing Cross. She nodded, her heart aching for him. She had imagined the horrors of the trenches, the constant fear, the loss of life. She had read the accounts in the newspapers, seen the wounded soldiers returning home, their bodies and minds shattered by the war. Shell shock, she whispered, the term a familiar one, a catch-all phrase for the invisible wounds of war. He shook his head.
More than that, he said. Much more than that.
He walked over to the window, staring out at the darkened street below. His silhouette was outlined against the faint glow of the gaslight, a lonely figure burdened by secrets. I was involved in intelligence work, he finally said, his voice barely audible above the sounds of a city. Things I can't talk about, things that are still classified. Espionage. The word hung in the air, heavy with implications. She had read stories of spies, of secret missions, of betrayals and double crosses. But those were just stories, fictional accounts of a world she had never imagined Daniel would inhabit. But the war is over, she said, her voice confused. Why are you still hiding? He turned back to her, his face etched with a weariness that seemed to go beyond the physical. Some things don't end with the armistice, Evie. Some debts can never be repaid. He walked over to the chest of drawers and opened the top drawer, pulling out a small, worn leather-bound book. He held it out to her.
This is yours, he said.
I found it in the garden. You must have dropped it. She took the book, her fingers brushing against his. It was her diary, the one she had kept throughout the war, filled with her thoughts, her fears, her hopes, and her unwavering love for him. She hadn't even realized she'd lost it. I must have dropped it when I saw you, she said, her voice trembling. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the diary, as if it held the key to their past, and perhaps their future. Read it, he said, his voice low and urgent. Read it tonight. And then we'll talk. Then I'll tell you everything. He turned away again, walking back to the window, leaving her alone with her diary and the weight of his unspoken words. She opened the book, her hands shaking, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. What secrets did it hold? What truths would be revealed? And would those truths bring them closer together or tear them apart forever? The scent of the bakery below filled the room, a sweet and deceptive fragrance masking a bitter and uncertain truth waiting to be unearthed. The gaslight flickered, casting its uncertain glow on the pages of her past. Chapter 4. The Unsent Letter. The diary felt heavy in her hands, the leather worn smooth from years of use. It was a repository of her innermost thoughts, a confidant she had shared her deepest fears and longings with during the long, lonely years of the war. She hadn't written in it since the armistice, the joy of the war's end quickly overshadowed by the crushing disappointment of Daniel's absence. She opened it to the last entry, dated November 11th, 1918. Her own handwriting, neat and precise, stared back at her, a stark reminder of the hope she had felt that day, a hope that had been cruelly dashed. The war is over. The bells are ringing, people are dancing in the streets, but my heart is heavy. Daniel hasn't come home. I waited at Charing Cross all day, scanning the faces of the returning soldiers, but he wasn't among them. Is he still alive? Is he injured? The uncertainty is unbearable. I pray he is safe, that he'll return to me soon. We'll have our dance, Daniel. I promise you. She closed her eyes, a tear escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. The memory of that day, the crushing weight of disappointment, washed over her anew. She had clung to that promise, that dance, as a symbol of their future, a future that had seemed so certain, so close, yet had remained tantalizingly out of reach. She turned back a few pages, reading earlier entries, reliving the anxieties, the hopes, the fears of those war-torn years. Her words spoke of air raids, of rationing, of the constant fear of receiving a telegram bearing the dreaded news of Daniel's death. But they also spoke of her unwavering love for him, her belief in his strength, her determination to wait for him, no matter how long it took. And then, she found it, tucked between the pages of an entry dated July 1917, a letter. An unsent letter, addressed to Daniel. She recognized her own handwriting, but she had no memory of writing it. The paper was yellowed and creased, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times. She carefully unfolded the letter, her hands trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. As she read the words, A cold dread washed over her, a chilling realization of a truth she had somehow suppressed, buried deep within the recesses of her memory. My dearest Daniel, I don't know if this letter will ever reach you, but I have to write it. I have to tell you the truth, even though it may break both our hearts. I met someone else. His name is Arthur, and he works at the Ministry of War. He's kind and gentle, and he's here. He's not fighting in the trenches, risking his life every day. He offers me security, a future that seems less uncertain than the one we have. I'm so sorry, Daniel. I know this will hurt you, but I can't pretend any longer. I've fallen in love with Arthur, and I've agreed to marry him. Please forgive me. I will always cherish the memories we shared, but I have to move on. I have to choose a life that feels safe. Evelyn. The letter slipped from her numb fingers, fluttering to the floor like a fallen leaf. She stared at it, her mind reeling, her world collapsing around her. She had written those words. She had betrayed Daniel. She had chosen another man. But why couldn't she remember? How could she have forgotten something so significant, so life-altering? The memories, hazy and fragmented, began to surface. Arthur. The Ministry of War. The brief, ill-fated courtship. The guilt, the shame, the constant fear of Daniel finding out. And then the realization. She had never sent the letter. She had written it, poured out her conflicted emotions, but she had never mailed it. She had changed her mind, unable to go through with the betrayal. She had chosen Daniel, in her heart, even though she had never told him about Arthur. But Daniel had found the letter. He had read it. He believed she had betrayed him. That's why he hadn't come to her at the station. That's why he had stayed away. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place, revealing a picture that was both heartbreaking and terrifying. He thought she had moved on, that she had chosen another man. And he had let her, believing she no longer loved him. The weight of her forgotten sin pressed down on her, crushing her with guilt and regret. She had to tell him the truth. She had to explain. But how could she? How could she undo the damage caused by her own words, by a letter she had never intended him to see? The unsent letter lay on the floor, a silent accusation, a testament to her own weakness and the cruel twists of fate that had brought them to this point. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, the silence deafening. Chapter 5. A promise etched in glass. The silence in the room was broken only by the soft ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece, each tick a stark reminder of the passing time, of the years lost, of the misunderstandings that had grown like weeds between them. Evelyn picked up the letter, her fingers tracing the faded ink, the words a painful echo of a past she had tried to bury. Daniel was still standing by the window, his back to her, his silhouette a dark outline against the faint light filtering through the curtain. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, since handing her the diary. She wondered what he was thinking, what emotions were raging within him. Anger? Hurt? Betrayal? She had to speak, to explain, to somehow bridge the chasm that had opened up between them. But the words caught in her throat, choked by the guilt and shame that washed over her anew. Daniel, she finally whispered, her voice trembling. I can explain. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her words. He remained motionless, a statue carved from the shadows of the night. She rose from the chair, her legs shaky, and walked towards him, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. She stopped a few feet away, hesitant to touch him, afraid of his reaction. I never sent it, she said, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her heart. I wrote it, but I never sent it. I changed my mind. He slowly turned, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and disbelief. He looked at the letter in her hand, then at her, his gaze searching hers, as if trying to decipher the truth.
Why?
He asked, his voice hoarse and raw. Why did you write it? She took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze, to confront the consequences of her actions.
I was scared, she confessed. The war, it was terrifying.
The thought of you not coming back, it was unbearable. Arthur, he offered me security, a sense of normalcy in a world that had gone mad. "And you loved him?" he asked, the question a sharp knife twisting in her heart. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I thought I did for a while. But it wasn't love.
It was a refuge.
A way to escape the fear, the uncertainty. But it wasn't real. You were always the one, Daniel. Always." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, trying to find a flicker of deceit, a hint of insincerity. But there was none. Only the raw, honest truth of her confession. He reached out and took the letter from her hand, his fingers brushing against hers, sending a shiver through her body. He unfolded it, his gaze scanning the words, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "I found this in your diary," he said, his voice low and strained. "In the garden. After I saw you at the station. I didn't know you were there," she whispered. I would have come to you." He nodded, his gaze still fixed on the letter. "I know," he said. "I saw the look on your face. The hope and then the disappointment. I thought it was because you had seen me and you didn't want me anymore." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "I thought you had moved on, that you had found someone else, someone better, someone who wasn't broken." "You're not broken, Daniel," she said, her voice firm, her hand reaching out to touch his cheek. "You're wounded, but you're not broken." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down his weathered cheek. "The things I saw," he whispered, "the things I did, they haunt me, Evie. They'll always haunt me." She knew he was talking about his intelligence work, the secrets he still couldn't reveal. She didn't press him, didn't demand answers. She understood, in a way she hadn't before, the weight of the burdens he carried. He opened his eyes, his gaze locking with hers.
"I wanted to come to you," he said.
"But I couldn't. I thought I was protecting you, keeping you safe from the darkness that followed me." He looked down at the letter again, then slowly, deliberately, he tore it in half. And then again, and again, until it was nothing but small, tattered pieces of paper. He let the pieces fall to the floor, a symbolic gesture of letting go of the past, of the misunderstanding that had kept them apart. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His hand was warm now, the coldness gone, replaced by a gentle strength that reassured her. Can we start again?" he asked, his voice hesitant, his eyes filled with a fragile hope. She nodded, tears streaming down her face, a smile breaking through the sadness. "Yes," she whispered. "We can." He pulled her close, embracing her tightly, his body trembling against hers. She held him close, her arms wrapping around him, her heart overflowing with a love that had survived the war, the secrets, the betrayals. He kissed her then, a gentle, tentative kiss at first, then deepening, becoming more passionate, a promise of a future they would build together, brick by brick, from the ruins of their past. Outside the window, a shard of broken glass, part of a shattered window pane, reflected a beam from inside, and for just a split second, it was possible to discern two words etched crudely but with feeling into the glass. "Forever, Evie." The clock kept ticking. Chapter 6. The Hospital Ward Secret. The embrace lingered, a silent promise of reconciliation, of a new beginning forged from the ashes of misunderstanding. But the air in the small room still held a residue of unease, a sense of unspoken secrets that lingered like a persistent cough. Daniel, though seemingly relieved by Evelyn's explanation, still carried a shadow in his eyes, a guardedness that hadn't fully dissipated. He pulled back slightly, his hand still holding hers, his gaze searching her face. "There's more, Evie," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "Something else I need to tell you. Something difficult." Evelyn braced herself, her heart tightening with a renewed sense of apprehension. What other secrets could he be hiding? What other burdens was he carrying? "Tell me," she said, her voice calm despite the turmoil within her. "I'm ready." He led her to the two chairs by the small table, and they sat down, facing each other, their hands still intertwined. The gaslight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, mirroring the uncertainty of the moment. After I saw you at the station, he began, his voice strained. I didn't go far. I stayed in London, watching you from a distance, making sure you were safe. Safe from what? She asked, confused. He hesitated, his gaze darting around the room, as if searching for the right words. From the people I was working with, he finally said. They weren't always on the right side of things, Evie. There were compromises. Deals made in the shadows. He paused, taking a deep breath, his face etched with a mixture of guilt and regret. I got involved in something dangerous. Something that put you at risk. Without your knowledge, of course. I never intended for you to be involved. What kind of danger? She asked, her voice trembling. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain that went beyond anything she had seen before. There was a leak, he said. Someone in my unit was passing information to the enemy. I was tasked with finding out who it was. He paused again, his gaze dropping to their clasped hands. And I suspected someone close to you. Her heart skipped a beat. Close to me? Who? He hesitated, his grip on her hands tightening. Arthur, he whispered. The name hit her like a physical blow. Arthur. The man she had almost married. The man she had confided in, trusted. A spy? It seemed impossible, unbelievable. No, she said, shaking her head. It can't be. Arthur wouldn't. I had proof, Daniel said, his voice firm, his gaze meeting hers. Circumstantial, perhaps, but compelling. He had access to classified information. He had unexplained absences. He met with known enemy contacts. He paused, his face etched with a weariness that seemed to age him beyond his years. I was ordered to eliminate him. Eliminate. The word hung in the air, cold and brutal. She understood its meaning. To kill. Daniel had been ordered to kill Arthur. Did you? She whispered, her voice barely audible. He shook his head. No, he said. I couldn't. Not without absolute proof. And not without telling you. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and guilt. I disobeyed a direct order, Evie. I risked my own life, my own career, to protect you, to protect him. Because I knew how much he meant to you, even though I believed he was a traitor. He paused, his gaze dropping to their clasped hands again. But then he disappeared. Vanished without a trace. A few weeks after the armistice. Disappeared. The word echoed in her mind, adding another layer of mystery to the already complex situation. Where had Arthur gone? Had he been captured by the enemy? Had he fled? Or had someone else eliminated him? I don't know what happened to him, Daniel said, his voice filled with uncertainty. But I know this. His disappearance, it changed everything. The investigation was closed. My superiors, they weren't happy. They suspected I was involved, that I had helped him escape. He looked up at her, his eyes pleading for understanding. That's why I had to stay away, Evie. I was under surveillance. They were watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I couldn't risk contacting you, putting you in danger again. He released a long sigh. There's a ward in St. Thomas's, he continued, looking at her with new intensity. Ward B. Ask for Nurse Jennings. She knows some of what happened. The hospital's name, the specific ward, the nurse's name, it was a tangible lead, a thread to pull in the unraveling tapestry of secrets. Why a hospital ward? What secret did Nurse Jennings hold? The questions piled up, but the mention of a specific location, a person to speak with, gave Evelyn a flicker of hope. It was a starting point, a way to begin untangling the truth. The ticking clock seemed a little less loud. Chapter 7. Beneath a sky of smoke and stars. The revelation about Arthur, the suspicion of espionage, and Daniel's subsequent disappearance hung heavy in the air, a tangled web of intrigue that Evelyn felt increasingly caught in. The mention of Nurse Jennings and Ward B at St. Thomas's Hospital offered a sliver of hope, a potential path to understanding the complex truth that Daniel was struggling to articulate. Before she could question him further, a sudden, insistent knocking on the door startled them both. Daniel's eyes widened with alarm, his body tensing, his hand instinctively reaching inside his coat, as if for a weapon. Stay here, he whispered, his voice urgent. Don't make a sound. He moved swiftly and silently to the door, pressing his ear against it, listening intently. The knocking came again, louder this time, accompanied by a muffled voice. Mr. Mercer? Are you in there? It's Inspector Davies. Daniel relaxed slightly, but the tension remained in his shoulders, in the set of his jaw. He glanced at Evelyn, his eyes conveying a silent warning. He opened the door cautiously, revealing a tall, stern-faced man in a dark suit standing in the hallway. Inspector Davies. The name was vaguely familiar to Evelyn. She had seen it mentioned in newspaper articles about wartime investigations. Inspector, Daniel said, his voice calm and controlled, betraying none of the alarm he had shown moments before. What can I do for you? I need to ask you a few questions, Mr. Mercer, Davies said, his voice firm and authoritative. About the disappearance of Arthur Finch. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. Arthur Finch. The name echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the unresolved mystery of the man she had almost married, the man who was now suspected of being a traitor. Daniel stepped aside, inviting the inspector into the room. Davies entered, his gaze sweeping the small space, taking in the meager furnishings, the faded curtains, the overall air of secrecy and desperation. His eyes landed on Evelyn, his expression hardening slightly. And who is this? He asked, his voice sharp and probing. This is Evelyn Carter, Daniel said, his voice steady. A friend. Davies nodded, his gaze lingering on Evelyn, assessing her, questioning her presence. Miss Carter, he said, his voice polite but formal. I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to leave. This is a matter of national security. Evelyn hesitated, her gaze meeting Daniel's. She wanted to stay, to hear what the inspector had to say, to be a part of the unfolding drama. But she knew she couldn't. Daniel's eyes conveyed a silent plea, a warning that her presence could complicate matters, could even put her in danger. Of course, Inspector, she said, her voice trembling slightly. She rose from her chair, her legs feeling unsteady. She walked towards the door, her heart pounding in her chest. As she passed Daniel, he reached out and squeezed her hand, a brief, reassuring touch that conveyed a message of hope and reassurance. I'll find you, he whispered, his voice barely audible. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She stepped out into the hallway, closing the door behind her, leaving Daniel alone with the inspector, alone with the secrets that still threatened to consume him. She leaned against the wall, her ear pressed against the door, trying to hear what was being said inside. But the voices were muffled, indistinct, the conversation shrouded in secrecy. She waited, her mind racing, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She had to know the truth about Arthur, about Daniel's involvement, about the danger that still seemed to lurk around every corner. After what seemed like an eternity, the door opened, and Inspector Davies emerged, his face grim and unreadable. He nodded curtly to Evelyn, then walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Daniel stood in the doorway, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a weariness that seemed to have deepened in the short time she had been gone. He beckoned her back inside, closing the door behind them, locking it this time, as if to shut out the world and the dangers that lurked within it. What did he want? She asked, her voice urgent. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. He's still investigating Arthur's disappearance, he said. They think I know more than I'm telling them. Do you? She asked, her gaze searching his. He hesitated, then nodded. There are things I haven't told anyone, he said. Things I can't tell anyone. Not yet. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and despair. But I will find out what happened to him, Evie, he said. I promise you. I owe it to you, and I owe it to myself. He walked over to the window, staring out at the night sky, a sky filled with smoke and stars, a reflection of the turmoil and the hope that mingled within him. And then, he said, his voice barely audible, then we can finally be free. The promise hung in the air, fragile yet potent, a beacon in the darkness that surrounded them. The sky outside seemed to offer no answers, only a vast, indifferent expanse. Chapter 8. The Dance of Shadows. The promise Daniel made, whispered against the backdrop of the smoke-filled London sky, lingered in the air, a fragile counterpoint to the weight of secrets and suspicion that still permeated the small room. Evelyn felt a surge of hope, a flicker of belief in the possibility of a future free from the shadows of the war, but it was tempered by a gnawing unease, a sense that the path to that future would be fraught with danger and uncertainty. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence that had fallen between them. Daniel turned from the window, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the gaslight. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and something else. Something that looked like fear. "We go to St. Thomas's," he said, his voice firm. "We talk to Nurse Jennings. She might have some answers." "But what if the inspector is watching you?" she asked, her voice concerned. "He suspects you, Daniel. He could be following you." He nodded, his jaw tightening.
"I know," he said.
"But we have to take the risk. It's the only way to find out the truth." He walked over to the chest of drawers and opened the bottom drawer, pulling out a small, worn leather satchel. He opened it, revealing a collection of items, a folded map of London, a small notebook, a pen, and a pistol. Evelyn's eyes widened with alarm. "Daniel, what is that?" He hesitated, then closed the satchel, his hand lingering on the flap. "Protection," he said, his voice low and guarded. "Just in case." The sight of the weapon, a stark reminder of the danger they were facing, sent a shiver down her spine. She had never imagined herself caught in such a situation, a world of spies, of secrets, of life and death decisions. "I'm scared, Daniel," she confessed, her voice trembling. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "I know," he said. "But I won't let anything happen to you, Evie. I promise." His words, though meant to comfort her, only heightened her anxiety. She knew he was putting himself at risk, that he was walking a tightrope between loyalty and betrayal, between duty and love. They left the room, descending the stairs and stepping out into the cool night air. The streets were relatively quiet, the usual hustle and bustle of London life muted by the late hour. The gaslights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to follow them, mimicking their own movements, their own fears. They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing on the pavement, their hands clasped tightly together. They were heading towards Westminster Bridge, the closest route to St. Thomas's Hospital, which lay on the south bank of the Thames. As they approached the bridge, Evelyn noticed a figure lurking in the shadows, a man in a dark coat, his face obscured by the dim light. He seemed to be watching them, his gaze fixed on Daniel. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice urgent. "I think we're being followed." He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing. He recognized the man. It was one of Inspector Davies's men, a detective named Miller, known for his persistence and his ruthlessness. "Damn," he muttered under his breath. "He's good." He pulled Evelyn into a narrow alleyway, a dark, secluded passage between two buildings. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and refuse, a stark contrast to the relative openness of the street. "We need to lose him," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We can't let him see us go to the hospital." He looked around, his eyes scanning the alleyway, searching for an escape route. There was a small, boarded-up window at the back of one of the buildings, a potential point of entry. "We'll have to go through there," he said, pointing to the window. "It's risky, but it's our only chance." He pulled out a small pocketknife and began working on the boards, prying them loose one by one. The wood creaked and groaned, the sound echoing in the narrow space, threatening to betray their presence. Evelyn watched him, her heart pounding in her chest, her fear mixed with a strange sense of exhilaration. She was caught in a dance of shadows, a dangerous game of cat and mouse, with the stakes higher than she had ever imagined. The alleyway felt like a trap, but also a strange kind of sanctuary, a hidden world where the rules of normal life didn't apply. She had to trust Daniel, to rely on his instincts, his skills, his determination to protect her. This was their waltz, not the one of ballrooms, but of survival. Chapter 9. Scars of the Somme. The boards gave way with a splintering crack, revealing a dark, dusty interior. Daniel peered inside, his senses alert for any sign of danger. The air that wafted out smelled of mildew and decay, the scent of long abandonment. "Stay close to me," he whispered, his hand reaching for hers. He squeezed through the opening, pulling Evelyn in after him. They found themselves in a small, abandoned storeroom, filled with cobwebs, broken furniture, and the detritus of a forgotten life. The only light came from the sliver of moon visible through the grimy window they had just forced open. Daniel closed the window as best he could, wedging the broken boards back into place, a temporary barrier against detection. They were trapped, for the moment, hidden from the prying eyes of Inspector Davies's man, but also isolated, vulnerable. "Where are we?" Evelyn whispered, her voice echoing in the silent room. Daniel pulled out a small penlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, revealing the cramped confines of their hiding place. "Looks like an old tailor shop," he said, his voice low and cautious. "Probably been abandoned since the start of the war." He shone the light around the room, illuminating faded bolts of fabric, dusty mannequins, and a cutting table covered in a thick layer of grime. The air was thick with the scent of mothballs and decay, a reminder of the passage of time, of lives interrupted, of dreams abandoned. Evelyn shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her. The room felt cold and oppressive, a stark contrast to the warmth of Daniel's hand, which still held hers. "How long do we have to stay here?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly.
"Until Miller is gone," he said.
"We can't risk being seen." He led her to a corner of the room, behind a stack of dusty boxes, a relatively secluded spot where they could sit and wait. They sat down on the floor, their backs against the cold, damp wall, their bodies close together, sharing warmth and a sense of shared vulnerability. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the occasional scuttling of a mouse or the distant sounds of the city, muffled by the thick walls of the abandoned shop. Evelyn looked at Daniel, his face illuminated by the faint beam of the penlight, his features etched with a mixture of weariness and determination. She noticed, for the first time, a small scar above his left eyebrow, a thin, white line that hadn't been there before the war. She reached out and touched it gently, her fingers tracing the outline of the wound. "What happened here?" she asked, her voice soft. He hesitated, his gaze avoiding hers. "The Somme," he said, his voice barely audible. "A piece of shrapnel." The Somme. The name evoked images of unimaginable horror, of mud and blood, of trenches filled with death and despair. She had read the accounts in the newspapers, seen the photographs of the ravaged landscape, but she had never truly understood the reality of it, the toll it had taken on the men who had fought there. "It must have been terrifying," she whispered. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor.
"It was," he said.
"Worse than anything I could have imagined." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I saw things, Evie," he said. "Things that no one should ever have to see. I lost friends, good men, boys really, who never had a chance to live their lives." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a pain that went beyond physical wounds. "I killed men, Evie," he said. "I had to. It was war. But it changes you. It leaves scars that never fully heal." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. His hand was cold, despite the warmth of her touch. She wanted to comfort him, to ease his pain, but she knew there were no words that could truly heal the wounds of war. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for what you went through." He squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of her empathy, of her understanding. "I don't want to talk about it," he said, his voice firm.
"Not now."
"Not ever." She nodded, respecting his need for silence, for privacy. She understood, in a way she hadn't before, the depth of his trauma, the invisible wounds that he carried within him. They sat in silence for a long time, their bodies close together, their hands clasped tightly, sharing a moment of intimacy, of vulnerability, in the heart of a city scarred by war. The faint beam of the penlight illuminated their faces, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, a reminder of the darkness that surrounded them, but also of the enduring power of their love, a love that had survived the trenches, the secrets, the betrayals. The tailor shop, with its relics of a peaceful past, felt like a strange, ironic haven. The silence grew, and with it, a tentative peace. Chapter 10. The Lavender Fields Confession. The silence in the abandoned tailor shop was eventually broken by the faint sound of footsteps approaching, then receding, outside. Daniel, ever vigilant, held his breath, listening intently. After a few minutes, he cautiously peered through a crack in the boarded-up window. "He's gone," he whispered, relief evident in his voice. "Miller's gone." They emerged from their hiding place, stiff and sore from sitting on the cold floor, but grateful to be out of the cramped, dusty room. They made their way back to the street, cautiously looking both ways before stepping out into the open. The night air was cool and crisp, a welcome change from the stuffiness of the tailor shop. They continued their journey towards St. Thomas's Hospital, walking briskly, their senses alert for any sign of danger. As they crossed Westminster Bridge, the vast expanse of the Thames stretched out before them, reflecting the faint glow of the moon and the scattered lights of the city. The Houses of Parliament loomed in the distance, their imposing silhouettes a symbol of power and authority, a stark contrast to the clandestine world of espionage and betrayal that Daniel and Evelyn now found themselves inhabiting. They reached the hospital, a large, imposing building, its windows glowing with a soft, warm light, a beacon of hope and healing in the midst of the war-torn city. They entered the main entrance, the air filled with the antiseptic scent of disinfectant and the hushed murmur of voices. Daniel approached the reception desk, where a weary-looking nurse was sorting through a stack of papers. "We're here to see Nurse Jennings," he said, his voice low and discreet. "Ward B." The nurse looked up, her eyes scrutinizing them, assessing their appearance, their demeanor. She seemed to recognize Daniel's name, a flicker of something recognition, perhaps, or suspicion crossing her face. "Wait here," she said, her voice curt. She disappeared through a set of double doors, leaving Daniel and Evelyn alone in the waiting area. The minutes stretched into an eternity, the tension building with each passing moment. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with possibilities. What would Nurse Jennings know? What secrets would be revealed? Finally, the nurse returned, her expression unreadable. "Follow me," she said, her voice clipped. She led them through a maze of corridors, the air growing warmer, the scent of disinfectant stronger. They passed rooms filled with patients, some sleeping, some moaning in pain, some staring blankly at the ceiling, their faces etched with the scars of war. They reached Ward B, a long, dimly lit room filled with rows of beds, each occupied by a wounded soldier. The air was heavy with the smell of sickness and despair, a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict. The nurse stopped in front of a small office at the end of the ward. "Wait here," she said. She knocked on the door, then opened it and disappeared inside. Daniel and Evelyn stood outside the office, their hands clasped tightly together, their hearts pounding in unison. They could hear the murmur of voices from inside, but the words were indistinct, unintelligible. After a few minutes, the door opened, and a woman in a nurse's uniform emerged. She was older than Evelyn had expected, her face lined with experience, her eyes filled with a mixture of compassion and weariness. This was Nurse Jennings. "Mr. Mercer?" she said, her voice soft but firm. "And Miss Carter?" They nodded, their gazes fixed on her, waiting for her to speak, to reveal the secrets she held. She stepped aside, inviting them into the office. It was a small, cramped space, filled with medical charts, files, and a single desk cluttered with papers. A single window offered a view of a small, enclosed courtyard, where a few hardy plants struggled to survive in the London air. "Please sit down," she said, gesturing towards two chairs facing the desk. They sat down, their bodies tense, their minds racing. Nurse Jennings sat behind the desk, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze fixed on Daniel. "I know why you're here," she said, her voice low and steady. "It's about Arthur Finch." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. The name, spoken aloud in this sterile, clinical setting, seemed to carry even more weight, more significance. He was a patient here, Nurse Jennings continued.
For a short time.
After the armistice. What was wrong with him? Evelyn asked, her voice trembling. Nurse Jennings hesitated, her gaze shifting to Evelyn, then back to Daniel. He was suffering from a nervous condition, she said. Shell shock, they called it. But it was more than that. She paused, taking a deep breath, her face etched with a sadness that went beyond professional concern.
He was delusional, she said.
He talked about conspiracies, about being followed, about betraying his country. Did he mention me? Daniel asked, his voice tense. Nurse Jennings nodded. He did, she said. He said you were trying to help him, that you were the only one he could trust. She paused again, her gaze dropping to her hands. He also talked about a lavender field, she said. He kept repeating the words, the lavender field. The truth is in the lavender field. A lavender field. The words echoed in Evelyn's mind, a strange, unexpected detail in this already complex puzzle. What did it mean? Where was this lavender field? And what truth did it hold? The courtyard outside offered no clues, only a bleak patch of urban greenery. Nurse Jennings looked up, a single tear tracing a path down her lined cheek. He was a broken man, she whispered. The war, it destroyed him. But he clung to that lavender field, to some secret he believed was hidden there. The confession hung in the air, a poignant blend of medical observation and human tragedy. Chapter 11. Echoes in the Empty Cathedral. The mention of the lavender field, a seemingly incongruous detail in Arthur's fragmented ramblings, hung in the air, a tantalizing clue in the labyrinthine mystery surrounding his disappearance. Evelyn felt a surge of adrenaline, a flicker of hope amidst the despair and uncertainty. It was something tangible, a place they could search, a potential lead in a case that seemed to grow more complex with each revelation. Do you know where this lavender field is? Evelyn asked, her voice urgent, leaning forward in her chair. Nurse Jennings shook her head, her expression regretful.
No, she said.
He never said. It was just a recurring theme in his delusions. He would become agitated, repeating the phrase over and over again. The lavender field. The truth is in the lavender field. Daniel, who had been silent throughout the exchange, spoke up, his voice thoughtful. Did he mention any other details? Anything that might give us a clue to its location? Nurse Jennings closed her eyes, her brow furrowed in concentration, as if trying to recall every detail of her conversations with Arthur. He mentioned a church, she said, her voice hesitant. A church nearby. He said he could hear the bells. A church. Another piece of the puzzle. But which church? London was filled with churches, their bells ringing out across the city, a constant reminder of faith and hope, but also of loss and mourning. Did he say anything else about the church? Evelyn asked, her mind racing, trying to piece together the fragmented clues. Anything specific? A name? A location? Nurse Jennings shook her head again.
No, she said.
Just the bells. He said they comforted him. She paused, her gaze shifting to Daniel, her expression filled with a mixture of concern and something else. Pity? He was afraid, Mr. Mercer, she said, her voice low and steady. He was convinced someone was trying to kill him. Did he say who? Daniel asked, his voice tense. Nurse Jennings hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. He mentioned a name, she said, but it was garbled. I couldn't make it out. It sounded like M, or maybe N. M or N. Another frustratingly vague clue. It could be anyone, anything. A person, a place, an organization. The interview had reached a dead end, the tantalizing clues leading only to more questions, more uncertainty. Evelyn felt a wave of disappointment, a sense of frustration at the elusive nature of the truth. They thanked Nurse Jennings for her time, her willingness to share what little information she had. They left the hospital, stepping back out into the cool night air, the city lights casting a hazy glow on the streets. They walked in silence for a while, their thoughts consumed by the fragmented clues, the unanswered questions. The lavender field, the church bells, the mysterious M or N. How did it all fit together? What was the truth that Arthur Finch had been so desperate to reveal? As they approached St. Paul's Cathedral, its majestic dome looming large against the night sky, Daniel suddenly stopped, his gaze fixed on the iconic structure. "The bells," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He said he could hear the bells. Evelyn looked at him, her eyes widening with realization. St. Paul's was known for its bells, their resonant chimes echoing across the city. Could this be the church Arthur had mentioned? "It's worth a try," she said, her voice filled with a renewed sense of hope. They entered the cathedral, its vast interior dimly lit, the air filled with the scent of incense and the echoes of centuries of prayer. The cathedral was empty, the usual crowds of tourists and worshippers absent at this late hour. Only a few flickering candles illuminated the intricate carvings, the stained glass windows, the towering columns that reached towards the heavens. They wandered through the silent aisles, their footsteps echoing on the stone floor, their senses alert for any sign, any clue that might connect this place to Arthur Finch, to the lavender field, to the secrets he had carried. They found nothing. The cathedral, for all its grandeur and history, offered no answers, no revelations. It remained a silent witness to the mysteries of the past, a place of worship and solace, but not a source of information about Arthur's fate. As they were about to leave, disappointed and disheartened, Daniel noticed a small, almost hidden door tucked away behind a massive pillar. He tried the handle. It was unlocked. He glanced at Evelyn, a question in his eyes. She nodded, her heart pounding with anticipation. He pushed the door open, revealing a narrow, winding staircase leading upwards. The air that wafted out was cold and damp, carrying the scent of dust and old stone. "Where does this go?" Evelyn whispered. "I don't know," Daniel said, "but it's worth exploring." He started up the stairs, Evelyn following close behind, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The staircase seemed to go on forever, winding upwards into the darkness, a symbolic ascent into the unknown, into the heart of the mystery that had consumed them. The cathedral's vast emptiness felt both comforting and menacing, a sacred space holding secular secrets. Chapter 12. The Telegram's Omen. The winding staircase seemed to ascend endlessly, spiraling upwards into the heart of St. Paul's Cathedral. The air grew colder with each step, the stone walls damp and clammy to the touch. The only light came from the faint glow of Daniel's penlight, casting elongated shadows that danced on the walls, mimicking their own movements, their own anxieties. Finally, they reached a small, wooden door at the top of the stairs. Daniel tried the handle, and to their surprise, it turned easily. He pushed the door open, revealing a small, circular room, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight filtering through a series of narrow, arched windows. They were in the bell tower. The room was dominated by a massive framework of wooden beams, supporting a series of enormous bronze bells, their surfaces gleaming dully in the moonlight. The air was thick with the scent of metal and dust, a reminder of the centuries of history contained within these walls. Evelyn gasped, her eyes wide with awe and wonder. The sheer size and scale of the bells were breathtaking, their silent power a testament to the craftsmanship of generations past. Daniel shone his penlight around the room, illuminating the intricate workings of the bell mechanism, the ropes and pulleys that controlled the movement of the massive clappers. He was searching for something, anything, that might connect this place to Arthur Finch, to the lavender field, to the secrets he had carried. He said he could hear the bells, Daniel muttered, his voice echoing in the vast space. He said they comforted him. Evelyn walked over to one of the windows, looking out at the panoramic view of London spread out below. The city lights twinkled like stars, a vast tapestry of human life and activity, stretching as far as the eye could see. She could see the Thames, winding its way through the heart of the city, its surface reflecting the moonlight. She could see the Houses of Parliament, their imposing silhouettes a reminder of power and authority. And she could see, in the distance, a faint, dark patch, a smudge of shadow against the brighter lights of the city. "Daniel," she said, her voice trembling with excitement.
Look.
He joined her at the window, his gaze following hers. He saw the dark patch, the area of shadow that she was pointing to. "What is it?" he asked.
"I don't know," she said.
"But it looks different. Like it's not part of the city." Daniel pulled out his map of London, the one he had taken from his satchel earlier. He unfolded it, spreading it out on the floor, using his penlight to illuminate the intricate details. He traced his finger along the map, following the course of the Thames, searching for the area that corresponded to the dark patch they had seen from the window. "There," he said, his voice triumphant. "It's a rural area, just outside the city limits. Mitcham." Mitcham. The name was vaguely familiar to Evelyn. She had heard it mentioned in connection with lavender. "Mitcham is known for its lavender fields," she said, her voice filled with a sudden surge of realization. "They've been growing lavender there for centuries." The lavender field. Arthur's cryptic clue. It wasn't a delusion, it was real. And it was close. Within sight of St. Paul's, within earshot of the bells. Daniel folded the map, his eyes shining with excitement.
"We have to go there," he said.
Tomorrow. They left the bell tower, descending the winding staircase, their hearts pounding with anticipation. They had found a tangible lead, a real destination, a place where the truth might finally be revealed. As they emerged from the cathedral, stepping back out into the cool night air, a figure emerged from the shadows, blocking their path. It was Inspector Davies. "Mr. Mercer," he said, his voice cold and hard. "Miss Carter, I've been looking for you." Daniel's hand instinctively reached inside his coat, towards the pistol he carried. But Davies was quicker. He drew his own weapon, pointing it directly at Daniel. "Don't even think about it, Mercer," he said, his voice menacing. "I have you under arrest." "For what?" Daniel asked, his voice defiant, his body tensing for action. "Obstruction of justice," Davies said. "Interfering with a police investigation. And suspicion of aiding and abetting a known enemy agent. Arthur Finch." The accusation hung in the air, heavy with implications. Davies believed Daniel was protecting Arthur, helping him to escape. "I'm innocent," Daniel said, his voice firm. "I'm trying to find the truth, just like you." Davies smirked. "The truth?"
he said.
"The truth is that you're a traitor, Mercer. Just like Finch." He gestured with his weapon.
"Get moving," he said.
"You're coming with me." As they walked, escorted by Davies, a newsboy ran past, shouting the evening headlines. He held up a paper, and a single word, in large, bold type, caught Evelyn's eye: telegram. Below it, a smaller headline: War Hero's Fate Revealed. Evelyn's blood ran cold. A telegram, the dreaded harbinger of bad news during the war. She had feared receiving one for years, fearing it would bring news of Daniel's death. But the war was over. Who was the telegram about? And what fate had been revealed? The omen was unmistakable and chilling. Chapter 13. A stolen kiss in the air raid shelter. The word telegram blazed in Evelyn's mind, a stark reminder of the war's pervasive reach, even in its aftermath. The newsboy's cry and the ominous headline sent a shiver of premonition down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that the telegram and the war hero's fate it revealed were somehow connected to their own increasingly perilous situation. Inspector Davies, his attention momentarily diverted by the newsboy, tightened his grip on Daniel's arm. "Keep moving," he growled, his voice devoid of any sympathy. They were marched towards a waiting police car, a black, boxy vehicle that seemed to embody the cold, impersonal authority of the law. Evelyn's mind raced, desperately trying to process the events of the past few hours. The discovery of the lavender field's potential location, the arrest, and now, this unsettling news headline. As they were about to be forced into the car, a sudden, piercing shriek shattered the night air. It was the unmistakable sound of an air raid siren, a chilling reminder of the recent war, a sound that had once sent Londoners scrambling for cover. Davies hesitated, his eyes darting skyward, his expression shifting from determination to concern. He knew, as did everyone in London, that even though the war was officially over, the threat of a stray bomb, a delayed action device, or even a rogue attack was still a possibility. Damn it, he muttered, his grip on Daniel loosening slightly. People began to emerge from buildings, their faces etched with fear and anxiety, their eyes searching the sky for any sign of danger. The streets, moments before quiet and deserted, were now filled with a chaotic mix of panic and urgency. Daniel saw his opportunity. He elbowed Davies sharply in the ribs, knocking the wind out of him, and simultaneously grabbed Evelyn's hand.
Run,
he shouted, his voice urgent. They broke free from Davies's grasp, sprinting away from the police car, dodging the panicked crowds, their hearts pounding in their chests. The air raid siren continued its mournful wail, a soundtrack to their desperate flight. They ran blindly, instinctively heading away from the main thoroughfare, towards the maze of side streets and alleyways that offered a semblance of cover. They could hear Davies shouting behind them, his voice filled with rage and frustration, but they didn't dare look back. They stumbled upon an open doorway, a sign above it indicating the entrance to a public air raid shelter. They plunged inside, descending a flight of concrete steps, the air growing cooler and damper with each step. The shelter was dimly lit by a few flickering electric bulbs, revealing a long, narrow space filled with rows of wooden benches. A few people were already huddled inside, their faces pale and anxious, their eyes fixed on the entrance, waiting for the inevitable sound of explosions. Daniel and Evelyn found a secluded spot at the far end of the shelter, behind a stack of sandbags, their bodies pressed close together, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. "Are you all right?" Daniel asked, his voice concerned, his hand gently touching Evelyn's face. She nodded, her heart still racing, her body trembling from the adrenaline surge. "Yes," she whispered. "But what about Davies? He'll be looking for us." Daniel shook his head. "He'll be preoccupied with the air raid," he said. "He won't risk searching for us in this chaos." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and something else. Something deeper, more intense. The fear, the adrenaline, the shared vulnerability had stripped away their inhibitions, leaving only the raw, unfiltered emotion that had been simmering between them since their reunion. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, questioning touch at first. She responded, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body melting into his. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more desperate, a release of all the pent-up emotions, the years of longing, the fear, the uncertainty. It was a stolen kiss, a moment of intimacy snatched from the jaws of danger, a reaffirmation of their love in the face of adversity. The air raid siren continued its mournful wail outside, but inside the shelter, there was only the sound of their breathing, the beating of their hearts, the silent language of their bodies. The kiss was a promise, a defiance, a declaration of their unbreakable bond. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated emotion, a fleeting escape from the harsh realities of their situation. The damp, musty air of the shelter seemed to fade away, replaced by the warmth of their embrace, the scent of his skin, the taste of his lips. It was a dance, not of shadows this time, but of light, of hope, of a love that refused to be extinguished. The world outside could fall apart, bombs could drop, but in that moment, nothing else mattered. Chapter 14. The Renegade Spy. The kiss ended as abruptly as it began, the reality of their situation crashing back in with the distant, muffled sound of explosions. The air raid, though seemingly not directly overhead, was a stark reminder of the danger they were in, of the relentless pursuit by Inspector Davies, and of the unresolved mystery surrounding Arthur Finch. Daniel pulled back slightly, his hand still holding Evelyn's face, his eyes searching hers. "We have to get out of here," he said, his voice urgent but low, "before the all-clear sounds and Davies finds us." Evelyn nodded, her heart still pounding, her body still tingling from the intensity of their embrace. The stolen kiss, a moment of pure connection, had strengthened her resolve, her determination to help Daniel, to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. They cautiously made their way to the shelter entrance, peering out into the street. The air raid seemed to be over, the explosions having ceased, the sirens silenced. The all clear had not yet sounded, but people were beginning to emerge from their hiding places, their faces etched with relief, their bodies shaking from the residual fear. "We need to get to Mitcham," Daniel said, his voice determined. "To the lavender fields. Before Davies catches up with us." They slipped out of the shelter, blending into the crowd, trying to remain inconspicuous. They walked quickly, avoiding the main thoroughfares, sticking to the side streets and alleyways, their senses alert for any sign of pursuit. As they were walking, Evelyn suddenly remembered the newsboy's cry, the telegram, the war hero's fate revealed. She had to know what it said. "Daniel," she said, her voice urgent. "We need to find a newspaper. I need to see what that headline was about." He hesitated, knowing that any delay could be dangerous, but he also understood her need to know, the nagging feeling that the telegram was somehow connected to their situation. They found a discarded newspaper lying on a doorstep, its pages crumpled and damp, but the headlines still legible. Evelyn grabbed it, her hands trembling, her eyes scanning the words. It wasn't about a war hero. It was about Arthur Finch. The headline read, "Missing Ministry Official Found Dead." Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes widening with horror. Arthur.
Dead.
The man she had almost married, the man Daniel had suspected of being a spy, the man who had disappeared without a trace. The article went on to say that Arthur's body had been found in a remote area of Surrey, near a lavender farm. He had been shot.
Shot.
The word echoed in Evelyn's mind, a brutal, final confirmation of his fate. She felt a wave of grief, of guilt, of confusion. Grief for the man she had once cared for, guilt for the letter she had written, confusion about the circumstances of his death. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion.
"Arthur, he's dead."
Daniel took the newspaper from her, his eyes scanning the article, his face hardening with a mixture of anger and determination. "It says he was found near a lavender farm," he said, his voice low and intense. "In Surrey. That's not far from Mitcham." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, revealing a picture that was both terrifying and heartbreaking. Arthur had been murdered, and his body had been dumped near a lavender field, the very place he had been so obsessed with in his final days. "He knew something," Daniel said, his voice firm. "Something dangerous. Something that got him killed." He looked at Evelyn, his eyes filled with a mixture of resolve and fear. "We have to get to Mitcham," he said. "We have to find that lavender field before whoever killed Arthur finds us." He paused, his gaze shifting to the newspaper again. "There's something else," he said, his voice troubled. "The article mentions a witness, a farm worker, who saw a man fleeing the scene. They describe him as tall, with dark hair and a military bearing." A military bearing. The description sent a shiver down Evelyn's spine. It could describe Daniel. It could describe Inspector Davies. It could describe any number of men who had served in the war. "They'll think it was you," she whispered, her voice filled with dread. Daniel nodded, his jaw tightening. "I know," he said. "That's why we have to find the real killer. We have to clear my name, and we have to find out what Arthur knew." He crumpled the newspaper, his expression resolute. "They've made me a renegade, Evie.
Fine.
Let's play the part, find the truth, and expose them all." He took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring, and, not waiting a beat, took off in a sprint towards the train station. The hunt was on. Chapter 15. Betrayal at Baker Street. The train journey to Mitcham was tense and silent. Daniel and Evelyn sat huddled together in a corner of a crowded carriage, their eyes constantly scanning their fellow passengers, wary of any sign of recognition, of any indication that they were being followed. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels on the tracks, usually a soothing sound, now seemed to amplify their anxiety, their sense of vulnerability. Evelyn reread the newspaper article about Arthur's death, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the fragmented information. The lavender field, the witness description, the military bearing, it all pointed to a conspiracy, a web of secrets and lies that reached far beyond Arthur's personal life, far beyond the confines of the Ministry of War. Who would want to kill him, Daniel? she asked, her voice low and troubled.
And why?
Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know, Evie, he said, but I have a feeling it's connected to the intelligence work I was involved in. Something I uncovered, something that Arthur stumbled upon. He paused, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape, his face etched with a mixture of guilt and regret. I should have told you everything from the start, he said. I thought I was protecting you, but I only put you in more danger. It's not your fault, Daniel, she said, her hand reaching out to touch his. You were trying to do what you thought was right. He squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of her understanding, of her unwavering support. But the guilt remained, a heavy burden that he carried, a constant reminder of the consequences of his actions, of his secrets. They arrived in Mitcham, a small, rural town, a stark contrast to the bustling city they had left behind. The air was fresh and clean, carrying the faint scent of lavender, a bittersweet reminder of the reason for their journey, of the tragedy that had brought them here. They found a local map and located the lavender farm mentioned in the newspaper article. It was on the outskirts of town, a sprawling expanse of purple fields, a beautiful, tranquil landscape that belied the dark secrets it held. As they were walking towards the farm, Daniel suddenly stopped, his eyes narrowing, his body tensing. What is it? Evelyn asked, her voice alarmed. He pointed to a figure standing across the street, a man in a dark coat, his face partially obscured by a hat. He was watching them, his gaze fixed on Daniel. It's Miller, Daniel whispered. Davies's man. He's found us. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. They had been so careful, so cautious, but it hadn't been enough. They were being followed, tracked, hunted. What do we do? She asked, her voice trembling. Daniel looked around, his eyes scanning the street, searching for an escape route. There was a small alleyway nearby, a narrow passage between two buildings. We'll try to lose him, he said, his voice low and urgent. But we have to be quick. They started walking briskly towards the alleyway, pretending not to notice Miller, trying to appear casual, unconcerned. But as they reached the entrance to the alleyway, Miller started to move, crossing the street, his pace quickening. They broke into a run, plunging into the narrow passage, their footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. They could hear Miller running behind them, his heavy breathing, his shouted commands to stop. They reached the end of the alleyway, emerging onto a busy street, filled with shoppers and market stalls. They tried to blend into the crowd, dodging pedestrians, weaving through the stalls, their hearts pounding in their chests. But Miller was gaining on them. He was faster, stronger, and he knew the area better than they did. Suddenly, a car pulled up beside them, its horn blaring, its engine roaring. Evelyn and Daniel stopped, startled, expecting the worst. A woman leaned out of the car window, her face familiar, her eyes filled with a mixture of urgency and concern. It was Nurse Jennings.
Get in,
she shouted, her voice barely audible above the din of the street.
quickly.
Daniel and Evelyn didn't hesitate. They scrambled into the back seat of the car, and Nurse Jennings sped off, leaving Miller standing on the sidewalk, his face contorted with rage and frustration. The relief was immense, but fleeting. How did you? Daniel began, but Jennings cut him off. No time. I followed you. From London, she said, eyes fixed on the road. Her voice was strained but purposeful. We need to talk. Somewhere safe. She glanced in the rearview mirror. And we need to talk now. She drove swiftly and silently through the back roads, leaving Mitcham behind. After what seemed like an eternity, she pulled up to a small, nondescript house on a quiet street. My sister's, she explained. She's away. Inside, the tension was palpable. Over cups of strong tea, Jennings finally spoke. Arthur was my patient, yes. But he was also my informant, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He was feeding me information about a rogue network within the ministry, within intelligence. She looked directly at Daniel. Within your unit, Mr. Mercer. Daniel stared at her, stunned. What kind of information? Names, she said, her voice grim. Plans. Betrayals. He was going to expose them all. He said they were selling secrets to the highest bidder. Even after the armistice. Evelyn gasped. But who? Jennings hesitated. He gave me one name, she whispered, just before he was taken from the hospital. He said, Baker. It all leads back to Baker. She looked at them both, her eyes filled with a desperate plea. You need to go to Baker Street. Find out who Baker is. Before they find you. The revelation was a bombshell. A traitor, deep within the British intelligence apparatus, still active, still dangerous. And Arthur had paid the price for trying to expose them. The address, Baker Street, was a concrete lead, but also a perilous one. It was a plunge into the heart of the enemy's territory. Chapter 16. The Weight of Unspoken Words. The revelation that Arthur Finch had been an informant for Nurse Jennings, and that his death was linked to a rogue network within British intelligence, added another layer of complexity and danger to their already perilous situation. The name Baker, and the directive to go to Baker Street, hung in the air, a heavy weight of unspoken words, of implied threats, of a conspiracy that reached far deeper than they had ever imagined. Daniel, still reeling from the shock of Jennings's disclosure, struggled to process the information. His former unit, his colleagues, his superiors, could they be involved? Could they be traitors? Baker Street it's the heart of intelligence operations, he said, his voice troubled. It's where many of the departments are headquartered. It could be anyone. But Arthur must have meant someone specific, Evelyn said, her voice urgent. Someone he trusted, someone he thought could help him expose the network. Or someone he feared, Jennings added, her voice grim. Someone he knew was at the center of it all. They sat in silence for a while, their minds racing, trying to make sense of the fragmented clues, the conflicting possibilities. The name Baker could be a code name, a pseudonym, or it could refer to a specific location, a building, an office on Baker Street. We have to go there, Daniel said, his voice firm, his eyes filled with a renewed sense of determination. We have to find out who Baker is and what they know. But it's dangerous, Daniel, Evelyn said, her voice concerned. You're a wanted man. Inspector Davies is looking for you. And now, this rogue network. They could be watching Baker Street, waiting for you. I know, he said. But we have no choice. It's the only way to clear my name, to find out what happened to Arthur, and to stop them. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and regret. You don't have to come with me, he said. It's too dangerous. I can handle this alone. She shook her head, her hand reaching out to touch his. No, she said. I'm not leaving you, Daniel. We're in this together. We'll face whatever comes, together. He squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of her unwavering loyalty, of her courage. He knew he couldn't protect her from the dangers ahead, but he also knew he couldn't face them without her. Jennings, who had been silent throughout the exchange, spoke up, her voice filled with a mixture of concern and hope. I can help you, she said. I have contacts on Baker Street. People I trust. People who might be able to provide information, assistance. She paused, her gaze shifting to Daniel, her expression serious. But you have to be careful, Mr. Mercer, she said. There are people there who would like to see you silenced. Permanently. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. She handed it to Daniel. This is the address of a safe house, she said. On Baker Street. It's used by people who need to disappear, to lie low. It's run by a woman named Mrs. Thompson. She's discreet. She can be trusted. Daniel took the paper, his fingers closing around it, his eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, Nurse Jennings, he said. You've risked a lot for us. She nodded, her face etched with a weariness that went beyond her years. Arthur was a good man, she said. He deserved justice. And I believe you can find it. They left Jennings's sister's house, feeling a mixture of trepidation and determination. They had a destination, a plan, and a contact, but they also knew they were walking into a trap, a den of vipers, where one wrong move could cost them their lives. As they walked towards the train station to return to London, Evelyn noticed a small, almost hidden shop tucked away on a side street. It was a bakery, its windows filled with displays of cakes and pastries, the air filled with the sweet scent of freshly baked bread. "Baker," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Could it be a bakery? Daniel stopped, his eyes following hers. He looked at the shop, his mind racing. It seemed unlikely, improbable, but it was a possibility. Arthur's clue had been cryptic, fragmented. It could refer to anything, anyone. "It's worth checking," he said. "But we have to be careful." They approached the shop cautiously, their senses alert for any sign of danger, for any indication that they were being watched. They entered the shop, the bell above the door jingling softly, announcing their presence. A woman stood behind the counter, her face lined with age, her eyes sharp and observant. She looked at them, her expression unreadable. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice neutral. Daniel hesitated, unsure how to proceed. He couldn't just ask if she was Baker, if she was involved in a conspiracy. He had to be subtle, indirect. "We were looking for a Mr. Baker," he began, watching her face closely. Any flicker of recognition, any sign of alarm. There was nothing. The woman frowned, her eyes searching Daniel's. "Baker? I don't know any Mr. Baker," she answered, shaking her head. "This is his address," Daniel tried, stepping closer to the counter. The old woman, suddenly and violently, swung a large rolling pin from beneath the counter, aiming for Daniel's head. "Get out!" she screamed, her voice a shocking, high-pitched shriek. "Get out before I call the police." The sudden violence was shocking. Evelyn and Daniel backed away, stunned and confused. It was clear. This wasn't the Baker they were looking for. It was a dead end, a false lead. But the woman's violent reaction, her immediate threat to call the police, was it simple fear? Or something more? The weight of unspoken suspicion felt heavier than ever. Chapter 17. Redemption in the Ruins. The Baker's violent reaction, though ultimately a dead end in their search for Baker, left Daniel and Evelyn shaken and unnerved. It was a stark reminder of the pervasive fear and suspicion that gripped London in the aftermath of the war, a climate where even the most innocent inquiry could be met with hostility and aggression. They retreated from the bakery, their hearts pounding, their minds racing. They knew they had to be more careful, more discreet in their investigation. They couldn't afford to draw any more attention to themselves, to arouse any more suspicion. They made their way back to the train station, their journey to Baker Street now tinged with a greater sense of urgency and danger. The encounter with the baker, though seemingly insignificant, had heightened their awareness of the risks they were facing, of the potential for betrayal at every turn. They arrived at Baker Street, the heart of London's intelligence community, a street lined with imposing buildings, their facades concealing a world of secrets, of clandestine operations, of power and intrigue. The address Nurse Jennings had given them, the safe house run by Mrs. Thompson, was located in a nondescript building, its entrance tucked away between a tobacconist and a tailor shop. They approached the building cautiously, their senses alert for any sign of surveillance, for any indication that they were being watched. They entered the building, finding themselves in a dimly lit hallway, the air thick with the scent of dust and old paper. A woman emerged from a doorway at the end of the hallway, her face lined with age, her eyes sharp and observant. She looked at them, her expression unreadable. This was Mrs. Thompson. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice neutral, her gaze sweeping over them, assessing them, questioning their presence. Daniel stepped forward, his hand reaching inside his coat, pulling out the piece of paper Nurse Jennings had given him. "We were told you might be able to help us," he said, his voice low and discreet. "We were given this address by Nurse Jennings." Mrs. Thompson's eyes flickered with recognition, a subtle shift in her expression that betrayed a hint of understanding. She took the paper from Daniel, her fingers brushing against his, her gaze locking with his. "Come with me," she said, her voice softer now, her tone more welcoming. She led them through a maze of corridors up a narrow staircase to a small, sparsely furnished room on the top floor of the building. The room was clean and tidy, but its furnishings were worn and faded, a testament to the many occupants who had sought refuge within its walls.
"You can stay here," she said.
"For as long as you need. No one will find you here." She paused, her gaze shifting to Evelyn, her expression softening slightly. "Nurse Jennings, she told me about you," she said. "About Arthur Finch. About the trouble you're in." "We're trying to find out what happened to him," Evelyn said, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and desperation. "We believe he was murdered because of something he knew, something he was trying to expose." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her face etched with a sadness that went beyond professional courtesy. "Arthur was a good man," she said. "He was caught in a web of deceit, of betrayal. He was trying to do the right thing, but he made powerful enemies." "Do you know who Baker is?" Daniel asked, his voice direct, his gaze fixed on Mrs. Thompson. She hesitated, her eyes darting around the room, as if searching for any sign of eavesdroppers, of hidden microphones. "I've heard the name," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's a code name, used by someone high up in the intelligence service. Someone with a lot of power." "Do you know who it refers to?" Evelyn asked, her voice urgent. Mrs. Thompson shook her head. "No," she said, "but I know someone who might." She paused, her gaze shifting to Daniel, her expression serious. "There's a man," she said. "He used to work for the ministry. He was a colleague of Arthur's. He was forced out, discredited. He lives in the ruins, near the old docks." The ruins. The image conjured up a picture of desolation, of abandonment, of a man living on the fringes of society, haunted by his past, by his failures. "What's his name?" Daniel asked. "They call him Silas," she said. "He's a broken man. But he knows things. He knows the secrets that others want to keep hidden." She paused again, her gaze locking with Daniel's. "He can be dangerous," she warned. "He trusts no one. But he might be your only hope." Mrs. Thompson gave them directions to the ruins, a desolate area of bombed-out buildings and derelict warehouses near the old docks, a place where the forgotten and the discarded remnants of the war found refuge. Daniel and Evelyn thanked Mrs. Thompson for her help, her willingness to risk her own safety to assist them. They left the safe house, stepping back out into the bustling streets of Baker Street, their hearts heavy with the weight of their mission, of the dangers that lay ahead. They knew that finding Silas, the broken man living in the ruins, was their last, best hope of uncovering the truth about Arthur's murder, of exposing the rogue network within British intelligence, of bringing Baker to justice. But they also knew that they were walking into a trap, a dangerous game of cat and mouse, where one wrong move could cost them their lives. The ruins, a symbol of destruction and despair, also held a glimmer of hope, a chance for redemption, for justice, for a future free from the shadows of the war. This was a different kind of war zone, but no less perilous. Chapter 18. The Last Waltz. The journey to the ruins was a descent into a world of shadows and decay, a stark contrast to the bustling streets of Baker Street. As Daniel and Evelyn approached the old docks, the buildings became increasingly derelict, their windows shattered, their walls scarred by bomb damage, their facades crumbling into dust. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, of rotting wood, of industrial waste, a pungent reminder of the war's destructive power. They found the ruins, a desolate landscape of bombed-out buildings and rubble-strewn streets, a place where the forgotten remnants of the war, both human and material, had found refuge. It was a place of shadows, of whispers, of secrets hidden beneath the debris of a shattered past. They searched for Silas, asking the few inhabitants of this desolate world, the homeless, the scavengers, the broken men and women who had sought refuge in the ruins, if they knew of a man called Silas, a former ministry official, a man who knew things. They were met with suspicion, with hostility, with blank stares and muttered curses. Silas was a ghost, a legend, a figure who existed on the fringes of this already marginalized community, a man who trusted no one, who shared his secrets with no one. Finally, they found someone who knew of him, an old woman huddled in a doorway, wrapped in rags, her face etched with the hardships of a life lived on the edge. "Silas?" she said, her voice raspy and weak. He's in the old church. What's left of it?
He stays there.
The old church. They found it, or rather, what was left of it, a skeletal structure of crumbling walls and shattered stained glass windows, its roof open to the sky, its interior filled with rubble and debris. It was a symbol of destruction, of faith lost, of a world shattered by war. They entered the church cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space, their senses alert for any sign of Silas, for any indication of danger. The air was cold and damp, carrying the scent of mildew and decay, a reminder of the passage of time, of the relentless forces of nature reclaiming what had once been a place of worship, of solace. They found him in the apse, huddled beneath a tattered blanket, his face hidden in the shadows, his body trembling with cold and something else. Fear?
Despair?
Daniel approached him slowly, his voice soft, his tone non-threatening. Silas?
He said.
We're looking for Silas. The figure stirred, slowly raising his head, his face emerging from the shadows. He was older than Daniel had expected, his hair white, his face lined with wrinkles, his eyes filled with a mixture of weariness and suspicion.
Who are you?
He asked, his voice raspy and weak, his gaze fixed on Daniel, assessing him, questioning his presence. My name is Daniel Mercer, Daniel said. This is Evelyn Carter. We were told you might be able to help us. We were told you know things. Silas's eyes flickered with recognition, a subtle shift in his expression that betrayed a hint of understanding. He had heard the name Mercer before.
What do you want?
He asked, his voice guarded, his body tensing, ready to flee. We're looking for information, Daniel said. About Arthur Finch. About his death. About a rogue network within the ministry. Within intelligence. Silas's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of fear crossing his face. He knew what Daniel was talking about. He knew the dangers involved. I don't know anything, he said, his voice trembling, his gaze darting around the church, as if expecting someone to appear, to silence him. We know you do, Silas, Evelyn said, her voice soft but firm. We know you were Arthur's colleague. We know you were forced out, discredited. We know you know the secrets that others want to keep hidden. Silas looked at her, his eyes searching hers, trying to assess her sincerity, her trustworthiness. He saw something in her eyes, a flicker of compassion, of understanding, that made him hesitate. He sighed, his body slumping, his shoulders sagging with the weight of his burdens, of his secrets. Arthur, he came to me, he said, his voice barely a whisper. He told me he had found something. Something big. Something that could bring down the whole house of cards. What was it? Daniel asked, his voice urgent. Silas hesitated, his gaze shifting to Daniel, then back to Evelyn.
He had proof, he said.
Evidence. Of a network of traitors. Selling secrets. To the enemy. Even after the armistice.
Did he say who?
Evelyn asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. Silas nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation.
He gave me a name, he said.
A code name. Baker. We know about Baker, Daniel said. But we don't know who it refers to. Silas looked at him, his eyes narrowing, his expression hardening. It refers to the head of the Special Operations Branch, he said. The man in charge of all covert operations. The man you reported to, Mercer. Daniel stared at him, stunned, his mind reeling. His superior. The man he had trusted. The man he had respected. The man he had followed a traitor? It can't be, he whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. It is, Silas said, his voice firm. Arthur had proof. He had documents, recordings, names. He was going to expose him. But Baker found out. He silenced him. He paused, his gaze dropping to the floor, his body trembling with a mixture of grief and guilt. I should have helped him, he said. I should have done something. But I was afraid. I was a coward. Daniel reached out and placed a hand on Silas's shoulder, his touch conveying a mixture of understanding and forgiveness. It's not too late, Silas, he said. You can still help us. You can still redeem yourself. Silas looked up at him, his eyes filled with a flicker of hope, a glimmer of courage. He had been living in the shadows for too long, haunted by his past, by his failures. Now he had a chance to make amends, to do the right thing, to help bring a traitor to justice. "I have the proof," he said. "Arthur, he gave it to me. For safekeeping. I hid it, where no one would find it," he told them. In the remnants of the church organ, behind a loose panel, Daniel and Evelyn worked together, pulling away the rotted wood, revealing a small, metal box. Inside a sheaf of papers and a small, wax-sealed cylinder of phonograph recording. As Daniel was securing the evidence, a sound. Footsteps. Silas's eyes widened in terror. "Baker," he mouthed, silently. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the doorway. Inspector Davies. But he was not alone. Beside him, a tall, imposing man with steel-gray hair, a military bearing, and a cold, calculating gaze. "So," the man said, a cruel smile playing on his lips, "the prodigal son returns. With his little helper, and the ever-so-helpful Mr. Silas. How convenient." He nodded to Davies, who stepped forward, gun drawn. "It's over, Mercer," Davies said, his voice cold and triumphant. But Daniel was ready. With a swift movement, he kicked a pile of rubble towards Davies, distracting him for a split second, and then lunged at the other man, tackling him to the ground. Evelyn, acting on instinct, grabbed the metal box and hurled it out of one of the shattered windows, sending it tumbling into the debris below. A struggle ensued, a chaotic melee of fists and shouts and grunts. Silas, summoning a strength he didn't know he possessed, grabbed Davies' gun arm, wrestling with him for control of the weapon. A shot rang out. Silence. Davies lay on the ground, clutching his leg, groaning in pain. The other man, Baker, was struggling to his feet, his face contorted with rage. Daniel was standing over him, his fists clenched, his eyes blazing with fury. But it was Silas who held Davies' gun, pointing it directly at Baker. "It's over," Silas said, his voice trembling but firm. "It's all over." As sirens wailed in the distance, drawing closer, Evelyn retrieved the metal box, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and triumph. It was done, and the evidence would see justice done. In the ruins of the old church, amidst the debris of war and betrayal, a semblance of order had been restored. A waltz of sorts had been danced, a dance of death, deception, and ultimately, redemption. Chapter 19. A dawn of shattered illusions. The arrival of the police, their sirens screaming through the desolate landscape of the ruins, marked the end of the immediate danger, but the beginning of a long and complex process of unraveling the truth, of bringing the guilty to justice, of healing the wounds of betrayal and deception. Baker, whose real name was revealed to be General Sir Alistair Fitzwilliam, the head of the Special Operations Branch, was arrested, along with Inspector Davies, who had been his accomplice, his enforcer, his loyal servant in a conspiracy that had spanned years, that had cost lives, that had threatened the very fabric of British intelligence. Silas, his courage rekindled, his conscience cleared, provided a full and detailed confession, recounting his years of working with Arthur Finch, their discovery of Fitzwilliam's treachery, their desperate attempts to expose him, and Arthur's ultimate sacrifice. The evidence found in the church organ, the documents, and the phonograph recording corroborated Silas's testimony, providing irrefutable proof of Fitzwilliam's guilt. Daniel, cleared of all suspicion, his name and reputation restored, was hailed as a hero, a man who had risked his life, his career, his freedom, to uncover the truth, to bring a traitor to justice. But the victory felt hollow, the triumph tinged with sadness, with the memory of Arthur Finch, of Silas's broken life, of the countless others who had suffered as a result of Fitzwilliam's greed and ambition. Evelyn, who had stood by Daniel throughout the ordeal, who had faced danger and uncertainty with unwavering courage and loyalty, was recognized for her bravery, her resilience, her unwavering support. But her thoughts were not on accolades or recognition, but on the future, on the possibility of building a life with Daniel, a life free from the shadows of the war, from the secrets and lies that had threatened to destroy them. The days that followed were a blur of interrogations, of legal proceedings, of media scrutiny. The story of Fitzwilliam's treachery, of Daniel's heroism, of Evelyn's unwavering support dominated the headlines, capturing the public's imagination, sparking a national debate about loyalty, about duty, about the corrosive effects of power and corruption. As the dust began to settle, as the legal proceedings moved towards their inevitable conclusion, Daniel and Evelyn found themselves standing on the platform at Charing Cross Station, the very place where they had parted ways 3 years earlier, the place where their journey had begun. The station was bustling with activity, with soldiers returning home, with families reunited, with the everyday hustle and bustle of London life resuming its normal rhythm. But for Daniel and Evelyn, it was a place of quiet reflection, of remembrance, of a bittersweet reunion that had been delayed, that had been tested, that had ultimately endured. "I never thought I'd see you again," Evelyn said, her voice soft, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and relief. Daniel reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, his touch conveying a warmth, a reassurance, that had been absent for so long. "I promised you a dance," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I always keep my promises." He led her to a quiet corner of the platform, away from the crowds, away from the noise and confusion. He hummed a tune, a slow, melancholic waltz, the same tune that had played on the gramophone in the abandoned garden, the tune that had brought them back together, that had set them on this perilous journey. They began to dance, their bodies swaying gently to the rhythm of the unspoken music, their eyes locked together, their hearts beating in unison. It wasn't a dance of celebration, of joy, but a dance of remembrance, of healing, of a love that had survived the war, the secrets, the betrayals. It was a dance of shadows and light, of hope and despair, of a future uncertain, but a future they would face together, hand in hand, their bond strengthened by the trials they had endured, by the sacrifices they had made. As they danced, the sun began to rise, casting a golden glow over the station, illuminating the faces of the returning soldiers, of the reunited families, of the everyday Londoners going about their lives. It was a new dawn, a new beginning, a chance to rebuild, to heal, to create a world free from the shadows of the past. But the illusions were shattered. The war, the secrets, the betrayals, had changed them, had left scars that would never fully heal. They were not the same people who had parted ways on this platform 3 years earlier. They were older, wiser, more cautious, more aware of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of even the most seemingly ordinary lives. The dance ended, and yet, the future was a question, unwritten and unknown. Chapter 20. The Final Embrace. The dawn brought with it a sense of closure, but also a profound awareness of the indelible marks left by the war and its aftermath. Daniel and Evelyn, standing on the platform at Charing Cross, were no longer the innocent, hopeful young lovers who had parted ways with the promise of a future dance. They were survivors, scarred but not broken, their love tempered by the fires of betrayal and loss, their future uncertain but filled with a quiet, resilient determination. They left the station, stepping out into the bustling streets of London, the city slowly awakening to a new day, a new era. The war was over, the conspiracy exposed, the traitors brought to justice, but the echoes of the past lingered, a constant reminder of the fragility of peace, of the enduring power of human fallibility. They walked in silence for a while, their hands clasped tightly together, their footsteps echoing on the pavement, their thoughts consumed by the events of the past few weeks, by the sacrifices they had made, by the uncertain future that lay ahead. "What will you do now?" Evelyn asked, her voice breaking the silence, her gaze fixed on Daniel, searching his face for answers, for reassurance. He hesitated, his brow furrowed in thought, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. He had been exonerated, his name cleared, his reputation restored, but the experience had changed him, had left him questioning his purpose, his place in the world. "I don't know," he said, his voice honest, his tone reflecting his inner turmoil. "I can't go back to what I was doing. Not after all of this." He paused, his gaze shifting to the passing crowds, to the everyday Londoners going about their lives, seemingly oblivious to the hidden dramas, the secret betrayals that had unfolded beneath the surface of their seemingly ordinary world. "I need time," he said. "Time to heal. Time to figure things out." Evelyn nodded, understanding his need for space, for reflection, for a period of adjustment after the trauma they had endured. She had her own adjustments to make, her own wounds to heal, her own future to contemplate. They reached her small flat, the place where she had lived alone for the past 3 years, the place where she had waited, prayed, and hoped for Daniel's return. It was a place filled with memories, with bittersweet reminders of their past, of their lost innocence, of their shattered illusions. They stood outside the door, their hands still clasped together, their eyes locked in a silent conversation, a silent understanding of the challenges that lay ahead, of the need for patience, for compassion, for a love that could withstand the test of time, of loss, of betrayal. "Will you stay?" she asked, her voice hesitant, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and fear. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a tenderness, a gratitude that went beyond words. He knew what she was asking, what she was offering. A chance to rebuild, to start anew, to create a future together, a future free from the shadows of the past. He nodded, his voice choked with emotion. "Yes," he whispered. "I'll stay." He reached out and touched her face, his fingers gently tracing the curve of her cheek, his touch conveying a warmth, a reassurance, that had been absent for so long. He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss, a promise of a future uncertain, but a future they would face together, hand in hand, their bond strengthened by the trials they had endured, by the sacrifices they had made. It wasn't a passionate kiss, a kiss of fiery desire, but a kiss of quiet commitment, of enduring love, of a shared journey that had just begun. It was a kiss of hope, of healing, of a new beginning forged from the ashes of the past. They entered the flat, closing the door behind them, shutting out the world, the noise, the confusion, the lingering echoes of the war. They were home, together at last. The flat was small and sparsely furnished, but it felt warm and welcoming, a haven from the storm, a place of refuge, of peace. They stood in the center of the room, their arms wrapped around each other, their bodies swaying gently, as if dancing to a silent, unspoken melody. It wasn't the dance they had promised each other, the dance they had dreamed of during the long, lonely years of separation. It was a different kind of dance, a dance of quiet intimacy, of shared vulnerability, of a love that had been tested, that had endured, that had emerged stronger, more resilient, more profound. It was a final embrace, a culmination of their journey, a testament to their unwavering loyalty, their courage, their enduring love. It was a promise of a future they would build together, brick by brick, from the ruins of their past, a future filled with hope, with healing, with the quiet joy of a love that had conquered all. The unspoken question of forever remained unanswered, but unnecessary. The embrace said it all. Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the enduring power of love, to the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds. Daniel and Evelyn built a life together, a quiet, unassuming life, far removed from the world of espionage and intrigue that had once threatened to destroy them. Daniel, unable to return to his former career, found solace in working with his hands, becoming a skilled carpenter, crafting furniture that was both beautiful and functional, a tangible expression of his newfound peace, his quiet strength. He never spoke of the war, of his experiences in the Special Operations Branch, of the betrayal he had uncovered, but the scars remained, a silent reminder of the darkness he had faced, of the sacrifices he had made. Evelyn continued to work at the bookshop, surrounded by the stories of others, by the wisdom of the ages, by the quiet comfort of literature. She found solace in words, in the power of narrative to heal, to inspire, to connect people across time and space. She never forgot Arthur Finch, the man she had almost married, the man who had been caught in a web of deceit, of betrayal, but she learned to live with the grief, with the guilt, with the understanding that life is often a series of choices, of compromises, of unexpected turns. They never had children, a silent sorrow that they shared, a consequence of the war, of the injuries Daniel had sustained, of the emotional scars that had never fully healed. But they found fulfillment in their love for each other, in their shared commitment to building a life of peace, of purpose, of quiet contentment. They often visited Mitcham, walking hand in hand through the lavender fields, the scent of the flowers a bittersweet reminder of their past, of the perilous journey that had brought them together, of the secrets that had been uncovered, of the lives that had been lost. They would stand in silence, gazing at the purple expanse, remembering Arthur, remembering Silas, remembering the sacrifices that had been made, the price that had been paid for truth and justice. One day, years after the war, they returned to St. Paul's Cathedral, to the bell tower where they had found the crucial clue, the turning point in their search for the truth. They climbed the winding staircase, their steps slower now, their bodies showing the signs of age, but their hearts still filled with the same unwavering love, the same quiet determination that had sustained them through the darkest days. They stood in the bell tower, gazing out at the panoramic view of London, the city that had been their battleground, their refuge, their home. The city had changed, had grown, had healed, but the scars of the war remained, visible in the rebuilt buildings, in the memorials, in the faces of the older generation. Daniel reached out and took Evelyn's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, his touch conveying a warmth, a reassurance that had never faded. "We made it," he said, his voice soft, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and peace. Evelyn nodded, her heart overflowing with love, with a profound sense of completion. They had survived, they had endured, they had found their way back to each other, against all odds. They stood in silence for a long time, their bodies close together, their hearts beating in unison, their love a silent testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, to the possibility of redemption, of healing, of a future built on the foundations of truth, of justice, of unwavering commitment. The bells of St. Paul's began to chime, their resonant tones echoing across the city, a song of hope, of remembrance, of a love that had conquered all. It was their song, their waltz, their final, enduring embrace. The sun began to set and life began to fade away peacefully.